Hi, I'm Jed. I'm going to be reading to you the first chapter of my book, The Ark Project. I must apologise for the lack of quality on this video. I'm purely recording this on my computer at home, so I don't have any fancy halo lights or microphones or anything like that. So I'm afraid you'll just have to put up with it. Anyway, hopefully you'll enjoy the story. Chapter 1 is called The Flying Pencil. David's fortunes began to change the day the pencil was thrown at his teacher's bottom. It was only a matter of time before someone gave it a go. You see, Mr. Torrance was of a rather unfortunate build. He was by far the tallest teacher at Elmswood High, and whilst he was on the whole a rather skinny man, he did have an extremely wide rear end. This in itself was not an issue. People come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and should never be made to feel ashamed of the way they look. Mr. Torrance's problem had far more to do with his ill-fitting clothing. He had been to every single clothes shop in town. He'd even taken the train out to the big city. But Mr. Torrance could still never find church trousers that fit him properly. His trousers were always too low and his shirts were never low enough, meaning that he was constantly having to tuck his shirt back into his trousers throughout the school day. The worst part of every lesson was always right at the start, when Mr. Torrance would awkwardly bend down to reach the box of textbooks he kept right at the front of the room. Now, you don't have to be a genius to work out the sight that Mr. Torrance's students would be subjected to. Yes, the shirt crept a few centimetres up his back, and naturally, the trousers slid a few centimetres downwards. Without realising it, Mr. Torrance was exposing the top third of his bottom to his class during every lesson. It was really as certain as the town hall's clock chiming on the hour or the cockerel crowing on Mr. Jessop's farm at sunrise. 5 minutes into every English lesson, and Mr. Torrance's bum would be seen by everyone. So, on that fateful day during David's third week at his new school, somebody finally plucked up the courage to pull off the unthinkable act of throwing a pencil at their teacher's exposed bottom. But which child would be brazen enough to attempt such a thing? Even though he was new to the school, there was one person who stuck out to David as being the most likely suspect. Becky O'Hara was your typical bully. From the outset, it was clear to David that she ruled the roost. Swinging on her chair, lounging at the back of the class with a gaggle of adoring friends who would burst into fits of giggles at every quick-fire insult and impersonation she would direct around the room. She had a knack, like most bullies do, of seeking out the easiest targets and exposing their flaws through unrelenting mockery. The vast majority of Becky's jokes would be at the expense of the ever-suffering Trevor. On the surface of things, he wouldn't be the kind of thick kid you would expect to be the target. In fact, if you were comparing Becky and Trevor purely on appearances, you would perhaps expect the handsome, smartly dressed, brown-haired boy to be more likely to pick on the girl with freckles and greasy ginger curls, and not the other way around. Trevor was effortlessly good at his schoolwork. He would always be the first finished, and any time Mr. Torrance or any of the other teachers asked a question, his hand would be straight up, and he would inevitably get the answer correct. This clearly got to Becky, who did her best to avoid doing any schoolwork at all. In English, Trevor was unfortunately seated directly in front of Becky. So, every time his pencil was put down and book closed in completion of a task, he would be treated to a nasty comment in his ear. "Oh, have a gold star, Trevi Poos," or "Now you're done, you can sit and think about all the friends you don't have." You get the idea. Sometimes, if Becky was feeling particularly mean, she would repeatedly kick the back of Trevor's chair as he was doing his work. Despite this, though, he would still always be the first finished. Some personalities might be able to defend themselves against behaviour such as this, counter the insults centred around his academic strengths with observations about her clear difficulties with schoolwork, or better yet, make himself a less obvious target by putting his hand up a little bit less or trying to work a tad slower. It was almost as if Trevor lived in his own little bubble, though. He seemed oblivious to how other people might react to his ability and intellect. If he knew the answer, I've lost my place. If he knew the answer to a question, why wouldn't he put his hand up? And so when the insults started coming, he seemed genuinely baffled and hurt as a result. With every kick in his chair and joke in his ear, Trevor seemed more and more withdrawn, lacking the confidence or know-how to make it all stop. Chris Brackett, who sat next to David in class, was another one who would regularly play victim to Becky. Chris was almost certainly the friendliest, most enthusiastic person David had ever met. From the moment David arrived at his new school, terrified about the stories he'd heard and the people he'd meet, chubby, cheerful Chris was there to ease his nerves with a handshake and a warm smile. He seemed genuinely interested to find out about David's family and where he'd come from, and didn't seem fazed at all when David revealed he'd come from the posh fee-paying school down the road. Why anyone would want to pick on someone as kind and likeable as Chris might seem a mystery, but David quickly understood the problem from the moment he stepped into his English class for the very first time. Mr. Torrance had directed him to sit at one of the tables at the front of the room, but when he pulled out the chair, he was surprised to find a bag of Walker's salt and vinegar lying on it. "Not there, new kid, that's Chris Packett's seat," shouted Becky from the back row, to a roar of laughter from the rest of the room. "Very funny, Becky. Chris Brackett, Chris Packett. I'm sure this'll never grow old," grins Chris, entering the class and tossing the crisps back at her. New parents, David had since thought, should be given some kind of nickname-generating machine to test potential name combinations before committing their child to a lifetime of teasing. At least Chris had the confidence and strength of personality to brush it off, though, and on the surface at least, never seemed that bothered by Becky's taunts. Nobody, it seemed, was exempt from being targeted by Becky. And so on that fateful Monday morning, when David saw the spinning pencil whiz above his head, he thought there could only be one person who had thrown it. In that moment, though, David was far less interested in where the pencil had come from than where it was going. For it was that time again, 5 minutes into the lesson, with Mr. Torrance's bottom at the front of the room marking itself out as the only possible target. Things seemed to move in slow motion. Everyone watched the pencil in silence as it span like the rotor blades of a helicopter in an action movie. It inched closer and closer, drawn perfectly to its target. The landing was one of the most extraordinary things David had ever seen. He was reminded of the Chinese divers he'd seen at last year's Olympics, spinning gracefully and meeting the water with barely a splash. For when the pencil finally met its destination, it dropped at surely 1,000,000 to 1 odds, lead side down into Mr. Torrance's bum crack with complete elegance. Everyone waited for a reaction, staring in shock at the teacher in front of them, who suddenly looked like he'd grown a pert little wooden tail. To everyone's complete bafflement, Mr. Torrance continued to fish around for textbooks. The throw had been so good that he hadn't even felt a thing. David stole a quick glance over the back of his shoulder, waiting to see Becky's gloating, mocking reaction. To his surprise, she was sat transfixed, mouth agog, along with the rest of the class. Amazed, David continued to scan the rest of the back row and search the culprits. There, in the back corner, stood a girl who had been so quiet and unassuming up until that point that not only was David unsure of her name, but he felt like he'd never even seen her before. The girl briefly perched on tiptoes, ensuring her throw had met its target, before fixing her tightly tied back hair, straightening her school dress, and sitting back down again, her expressionless face giving no hint of the triumphant feat she had just pulled off. Meanwhile, as time continued to shuffle forward at a snail's pace, Mr. Torrance, still unaware of the pencil's presence, was almost done gathering the textbooks. How completely and utterly humiliated he would feel when he realised what had happened, and what great pleasure the children would take in seeing their teacher's inevitable humiliation. So that's it. That was the first chapter. I'm going to try and do more of these videos as and when I can for the entirety of the book. So please stay tuned and look out for more videos. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll hear from me very soon. Bye.